The morning. Great. Well, so I took this institute last year. So I was, for those of you that are new, I was in your same spot. And since then, I've had some interesting experiences that I'm here to share with you today. And I want to make sure that I use my time as efficiently as possible. So I'm going to jump right into it. I need to share my screen. Make sure it looks good. All right, are you able to see?
We are.
Okay, sorry, I'm not, but let's see. And I apologize, that's Charlie. He is joining us also this morning. There's no one else here to guide him. So in relationship to some of the things that Kevin was just talking about, and that was included in the preparation, I'm really going to try to focus on course structure and design with the idea that flexibility really needs to be intentional and not what I would call spontaneous. And this is something that I learned the hard way, that intentional flexibility gives you great flow in your courses, whereas sometimes less intentional or more spontaneous things tend to lead to flops, at least again, in my case. So I'm kind of here's all the things that I did that didn't work out so well, but I've learned so much from, and I have no ego involved in that whatsoever. So it works for me. So the first thing I want to start with is suggesting something like a mistake philosophy. You might not consider that now, but you might want to think about the fact that, and as just was said, that part of being flexible and equitable is that you're transparent and you're vulnerable. And I try to be really transparent and vulnerable about mistakes, especially in the amount of complexities that we're adding to classes these days. So I think you might actually want to have a philosophy about mistakes, and that might be something to think about during the Institute, not just today, because they do happen. And yet I think the more important thing, other than saying they do happen, is what will you do when they happen? A mistake is maybe something that didn't quite go the way you meant it to, or so you made a decision that you didn't realize the implications of. And I love the quote that says, you know, mistakes are funny because you make your own, but then if you try to keep people from making theirs, they get mad. And I actually experienced that with some students this semester, in that I was trying to provide guidance, but the guidance wasn't quite welcome. And it was really because of something that happened that I wasn't really processing quite well. So we're gonna, in addition to pondering this mistake philosophy, we're going to explore the difference between spontaneous, flexible. I'm going to share with you my experience. And I do have a model of how I implemented HyFlex in my class that may be useful to you. And then also we'll reflect. Hopefully we have time. I'd love to hear what your ideas are. And I just put my slide deck link in the chat. I hope that's okay, Kevin.
Absolutely.
If anybody wants it while we're talking, all right? And I will try to monitor chat, but I have no problem if you just want to say out loud, Susan, I have a question. That's usually much more effective. Okay, so we're talking all about flexibility, but a lot of times I think things happen spontaneously and we think that's flexibility, like we make kind of adjustment right on the spot, and that's being flexible. And when I gave it some more thought and really looked at the words, they're not the same thing at all. And in fact, I suffered from spontaneity when I kind of lost sight of flexibility. So when we think of spontaneous, I like the idea that this is something self-generated. We do it ourselves. It's our own free choice, but often without planning, maybe a little random, and often really sudden without a warning. And all of those things usually aren't so great in a class. Every once in a while, maybe, but, and so the term down here, sorry, I cut it off. It says sometimes there's spontaneous combustion, and these little small explosions into one big one is kind of going to match what happened to me. Whereas if I was more wedded and more embedded with the idea of flexibility, I would always think of my course structure as very pliable, as bendable, as able to accommodate different things that come up, but without breaking, without losing sight of its core, its foundation, that it can be molded but not undermined. And instead of explosions, flexibility to me is it gives you the opportunity to flow in cycles, so we might have here, but not necessarily bend and then explode. So to me, those two different terms really help highlight what we need from flexible structure. So this is my plan from spring 2022. What I did is I implemented a HyFlex pilot design to assess outcomes from my course. And I thought, let's just give it a try. I'm ready to go. I didn't know, in parentheses, that I would be making a couple of big mistakes. The course that I did this in was a senior organizational communication theory course. So the students have had multiple courses before this. They're ready to really get their geek on, let's say, with theory. And we actually put it in the frame of meta theory. So we take them pretty far. The course design is I implemented a mixed limited HyFlex design, which I'll explain in just a minute, but it wasn't the whole semester. It was not all flex all semester. I introduced HyFlex experiences in an in-person course during this semester. Why did I do that? What was my rationale? Because I want to leverage the tech and the tools and the experiences from the last 4 semesters we've all had over the pandemic, as we've learned a lot about flexible designs and ways to do things that may be more efficient or beneficial to students. So it seemed like there was more to be done, and there were things I wanted to keep from the pandemic. So I wanted to support student learning, student engagement, student needs with a flexible design. I also think equity was part of this because it was making sure that all students had access to the learning cycles I was creating so that they could even plan ahead and participate based on a preference. So again, giving them some choice. And lastly, how is I thought I had an intentional course structure and design with flexible options. But the red is pointing out that I kind of made some assumptions. One, like, hey, we've been innovating for the last 2 years. This is going to be easy. Students will know what we're doing immediately. And also another assumption is that the flexible options can be easily introduced without a lot of clarity, right? But what I learned is that your flexibility needs to be both nimble and flexible, but it also needs to be consistent. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on my model just because I'm giving you the slides so you can look at it and you can always ask me questions later. But basically my slow rollout of the HyFlex model was I began my course as normal, and we did module 1 in person for about the first 3 weeks. Then started module 2 about weeks 4 and 5. And that's when I introduced each of the modes. So in-person mode, obviously, what would be students be responsible for that? Then in person or in Zoom synchronously, what were the expectations for that? And then a HyFlex day where students could be in person, they could be in Zoom synchronous, or they could be asynchronous and watch the recording later and follow up with the tasks. What happened spontaneously was the pandemic continued in the spring, and we had a lot of students still out needing to quarantine. So I quickly I started using Zoom recordings and allowed students to view the recording. And then that turned into allowing students to attend via Zoom. And before I knew it, in those first few weeks, students had concluded that there was a Zoom session that they could attend anytime during this semester. And when I would say no, it was available based on approval. And I reinforced that, it immediately became very unfair and confusing to the students. They just I didn't explain it. I didn't frame it correctly. So I had like these little explosions that kind of ended up imploding because in the entire semester, this impacted us for the remaining weeks. For the students felt things were more random and more inconsistent, and that kind of undermined the plan structure. And while everyone in terms of equity may have been experiencing these high flex preferences I was providing them, some were probably managing it better than others. So this is what my course model looked like. What I intended, if you can just see, is in the first two modules, very little high flex, mostly in person. In module 3, a blend of in-person and practicing the modes. And then here in module 4, more high flex, right? By then we should be really good with it and rely on it quite a bit. But as I said, it didn't quite work out that way. And ultimately what I ended up with was a flop. The class did just fine in all of my measurements of outcomes and student outcomes. They did as well as the previous course in the fall that was synchronous via Zoom compared to this high flex. So the outcomes were the same, but that feeling of students feeling lost on when we were doing different things at different times, and that assumption that they had access to Zoom all the time really undermined what I was planning to do throughout the semester. And I would just say that, you know, it was a flop in a sense that I can look back and realize that I had constantly addressed mistakes and asked students to bring errors to my attention, assuming errors would be like in Zoom or slides or things like that. But I needed a plan for when there was a mistake. I needed to reflect sooner, and I needed to do something about it more intentionally earlier. And I feel like that's really going to help. So my question for you all is, what did you learn? Have you ever had any flops in course structure? And again, we can share them. I assume we all have, because we're all interested in learning. And then I'm curious if you've learned anything from that, or how did you improve the structure? And I know I'm short on time. So there was a question right here. What did I mean by Zoom all the time? So last fall, the students we were in a Zoom synchronous class all semester long, no in person. In the spring semester, we were in person, and then some days we were in person live and Zoom live, so synchronous. And then on other days, we were both live in person, Zoom, or the students could asynchronously watch the recording. I hope that clarifies that. Kevin, what's a good idea here? Can I hear some ideas from some people that maybe want to share?
We've got some coming in the chat. So
Great.
We'll take maybe one more minute and then we'll hand the talking stick over to William Hardaway.
Great. Oh, I love Catherine's idea. She posts a goof policy where I promise them up front, my goofs, wrong test date, forget to open a module will never impact them, and I will correct them at my expense. That's great. And I love the title, Catherine. I think using our words really carefully is great. I needed something more than a goof policy. But that's a great idea. Yazdan.
Yes, you know, I wrote in the chat specifications grading. When, for example, you do homeworks, there is some policy if the students can retake that or resubmit again. So I think this is a not bad idea that we can do this with the students.
Oh, I agree. I think as long as it works for you, on Thursday, I'm going to talk about assessment and what multiple turn-ins or extensions can often do to undermine your structure. But I think that's a good idea. And then Teresa posted a comment that she was in a course that she thought was synchronous in Zoom, but it was online and asynchronous. Created lots more work for me to grade weekly activities, did not allow for real-time discussion. Yeah, again, that intentionality, whatever you're doing and trying to reach your outcomes, make sure how you're doing it with the students is going to do what you want it to do. Don't assume that it will. That's the biggest takeaway. If we're being transparent and vulnerable, we're going to describe what flexibility is, and we're going to make sure we all understand what that means. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. That's a wonderful way to kick off the examples. And like, as you mentioned, you'll be back tomorrow, next time. And so I'm gonna stop the recording so we have